I thought I'd give AI a test today, so I asked it a question. I said, "What's the greatest sermon ever preached?" And it said that was too hard to determine. I don't know that I've ever preached a great sermon. I hope someday I do. And I hope if I do, I have enough of a mind to remember that I did it so I can preach it again. But you know, today I was sitting there and I thought, I just want to listen to God today. I don't want to talk. I just want to listen to God. And I thought, whenever I really want to listen to God, I read what I think is the greatest sermon, and that's the Sermon on the Mount. And I think if I could sit and listen to anything Jesus ever taught or said, I think that's what I would want to do, is be there and to listen to Jesus speak those words. Because I think if you read that sermon, you really see kind of the mind of God. And I like that. And as I thought about that sermon today, I thought about sitting in that audience and listening to Jesus. And I thought, the first problem is I don't know Greek. But hopefully, if I was miraculous enough to go back in time and sit there, I'd be miraculous enough to understand Greek, I hope. Because I imagine that was a language. But I thought about that sermon, and I thought about what makes it great. And I kind of had to look at Matthew 5, the very beginning. And the first thing I thought was the reason it was great is because Jesus preached it, right? It was the speaker. You can never duplicate that, can you? We'll never be able to duplicate Jesus saying it himself. There's no way we could ever do that. And it had to be amazing, didn't it, to sit at Jesus' feet and to listen to what he had to say. And I'm so glad that it's recorded for us so that we can kind of put ourselves in the audience and sit back and think. Because I think the amazing thing about the Sermon on the Mount is that it's ageless, it's timeless. There's a lot of things in the Bible you could say, oh, well, this is, social circumstance, or this was because of the time, or Jesus was speaking to the Jew, or Jesus was speaking to the Gentile, or Jesus was whatever Jesus was doing. But, the Sermon on the Mount's one of those things it's just timeless. It's just one of those things that will never be out of date. And I think when you look at the crowds, and I've often thought about it, the crowds, his disciples came to him. He opened his mouth and began to teach them. It wasn't so much a sermon, it was, as it was a teaching moment, wasn't it? He was teaching them something. He wasn't just expounding on something that had already been said, or he wasn't just reading the law, he was teaching. It was new, it was fresh, it was different, it was something to hear. I think when you think about Jesus' words, you think about his authority. It's funny because I looked at the very beginning. Jesus saw the crowds. I've often thought about the people in the audience. There were those from all over, weren't there? It wasn't just Jews. It wasn't just Gentiles. It wasn't just scribes and Pharisees. It wasn't just disciples. It was everybody. As I've preached a lot of sermons, and I've never preached to that type of a diverse audience. I guess the closest you would come would be a funeral. Some funerals I've preached were pretty diverse, I got to tell you. Almost scary diverse, let me tell you right now. But that's one of those cases when you get to do that. But generally, for most preachers, you're never going to get to preach to the people who hate you, and the people who want to trick you, and the people who want to trap you, and the people who really want to listen to you, and the people who want something from you, and the people. You're never going to get that audience. It's just not going to happen. I wonder how I would preach if this morning, if there were people in the back or at the front, maybe they're probably at the front so they could stare you down. People who wanted to trap you, trick you, people who wanted to use your words against you. I often wonder how that would affect a sermon, how that would affect what you said. And yet Jesus had that very audience, didn't he? But Jesus had this authority that nobody else ever, ever, ever has had and never will have. You know, it's funny in Matthew 7, the very end, when Jesus had finished these words, the Sermon on the Mount, right? Matthew 5 to Matthew 7. When Jesus had finished these words, the crowd were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as their scribes. You know, their scribes could tell them the Old Testament, they could read it to them, they could quote it to them. The scribes knew that stuff. When Jesus was born and the wise men came to Herod and said, where's this Jesus going to be? It was the scribes who said Bethlehem. Jesus will be in Bethlehem. The scribes knew God's word better than anybody. And they could quote it to you, they could speak it to you, but they couldn't teach it. Jesus taught. He took those words and he made them mean something. He made them applicable to the people that were listening to him. You know, his audience was amazing. If you look at Matthew 4, before the Sermon on the Mount, it was really interesting because I think I've read the Sermon on the Mount, I don't know how many times. I've often thought that would be one passage of Scripture that I should memorize in its entirety. I've never done that, but I've often thought that would be a noble cause, to memorize the Sermon on the Mount in its entirety. But in Matthew 4, before that, large crowds followed him from Galilee, which is where Jesus began. That's where all of his apostles would come from except one. He was in Capernaum. Jesus, we believe, lived in Capernaum when he started his ministry, which is in Galilee, right by the Sea of Galilee, Sea of Tiberias, sometimes the Bible calls it. But it also says from Decapolis, which is Greek, which is 10 Greek cities, that region of 10 Greek cities. Jerusalem and Judea, which have been the Jews, that would have been the scribes, the Pharisees, the priests, the Jews. And from beyond the Jordan, which most scholars say would be Perea, which is very Gentile. So Jesus had this very diverse audience of people. And I've always said on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus had three basic groups of people. Because if you read Matthew 4, Jesus had already been performing miracles. Jesus had called his disciples in Matthew 4. All these things had happened. Jesus' popularity was growing. He had already begun doing things. People knew what he could do. And if you think about the crowd, there was three types of people. I always said there were three groups of people in this crowd. There were the skeptics, the Jews, the scribes, the Pharisees, the one who wanted to trick him, the one who wanted to prove him wrong. There were the ones who wanted something, right? There were the people who wanted Jesus to heal him, who wanted Jesus to do something for him. What can we get out of this guy? This guy does miracles. What can he do for me? And then there were the seekers, the ones who really wanted to know, really wanted to hang, really wanted to know what Jesus was saying, really wanted to listen to his words. And I think that audience would have been so difficult to preach to, where Jesus wanted to reach the ones who wanted him, but at the same time there were those who wanted to trick him, those who wanted to trap him, those who wanted to contest him, and those who really wanted something from him. And I think that was such a hard audience. But in Matthew 4, it really tells you about this diverse group of people that Jesus was speaking to, the Gentiles, the Jews, the scribes, the Pharisees, a very diverse group of people. There were Romans in there. There were probably soldiers in there. There were this diverse group of individuals that Jesus was really speaking to. But you know, the other thing is the timing of it. You know, in Luke 6, you get a Sermon on the Mount, and some scholars think it was the same. I really think it was two different occasions because it was really two different timelines. But in Matthew 4, this is at the beginning, right? They weren't quite to the point that they hated him yet, some of them. They weren't quite to the point they were ready to kill him yet. They were to the point they were still kind of stepping back and going, well, who is this guy? What's he got to say? You know, they were still kind of in that phase. As Jesus was walking by the Sea of Galilee, and this is the beginning, right? He saw two brothers and Andrew, his brother, casting a net. This is right before the Sermon on the Mount. This is Matthew 4. And he said to them, follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men. And they left their nets and followed him. And going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and John, in the boat with Zebedee, their father, mending their nets. And he called them. Immediately left the boat and their father and followed him. was really early in his ministry. You know, Matthew 4, Matthew 5 is beginning on the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 4, he's calling his disciples. The end of Matthew 4, large crowds were following him. And then beginning of Matthew 5, you know, he sat down, he was going to teach them. So it was a great time for him to do this sermon. It was a time when still people hadn't really formed an opinion about who Jesus was, still hadn't come to the conviction that, oh, we need to get him, or we need to kill him, or we need to get rid of him, or to the conviction that we need to follow him no matter what. It was a time when people were still trying to figure out who Jesus was and what Jesus was about. And Jesus was there, and he was giving him all this information. And I'm sure that when all of them left that sermon, they were all really talking about what was going on. But the other thing that was amazing, this is something I really like, and I actually had to go to a different translation than I generally use to get what I think is the proper translation of Isaiah 61:1. But, you know, when John the Baptist doubted Jesus, and John sent disciples to Jesus and said, "Are you the one we seek, or do we look for someone else?" And Jesus replied back to John's disciples, and he said, "Go tell John, right? The deaf hear, the lame walk, the blind see." But then Jesus said this amazing thing. He said, "The poor have the gospel preached to them." You know, part of the fulfillment of the prophecy of Isaiah 61, and it depends on translation, but I think this is the best one, New American Standard. Some of them say "to the afflicted," but I really think poor is the better deal. He says the son, and afflicted's not a bad thought. He says, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor," or the afflicted, depends on translation. "He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and freedom to the prisoners." Bring the good news to the poor. You know, you and me, we don't think much about that. But boy, in that day and time, they were just poor. They weren't just poor, they were poor in spirit. Isn't that what Jesus said at the beginning of the Beatitudes? Blessed are the poor in spirit, right? The ones left behind, the ones people look over, the ones people don't care about. You know, in Judaism, to be poor was to be cursed by God. It wasn't just you were poor, it's that God hadn't blessed you with finances. God hadn't blessed you with riches because somehow you had failed God. Otherwise, God would be blessing you. God would be multiplying your whatever you have, and yet he wasn't doing it. So the poor were looked down upon by God. And Jesus comes, and he's in Galilee, this poor region of the world, this fisherman region of the world. He's not in Judea. He's not in the place where the wealthy are and the rich are. He's in the poor part of the world, right? And he's preaching. He's proclaiming the gospel, isn't he? He's proclaiming the good news to the poor. You know, Jesus began it right off the Sermon on the Mount. If you read the Beatitudes, the Beatitudes are so amazing, because if you listen to the words of Jesus, Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those that mourn. Blessed are those that weep, for they will be comforted, right? Blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness. You know, Jesus looked at these group of people that didn't feel blessed and didn't feel important and didn't feel special, and Jesus looked at them, and he didn't say you will be blessed. If you really listen to what Jesus said, Jesus says he didn't say you will be blessed. Jesus says, blessed are you now. And sometimes that gives me chills. Jesus says, blessed are you where you're at. Blessed are you if you're poor. Blessed are you if you weep. Blessed are you. You know, you might not know this, but in the Hebrew, the word for poor in the Hebrew that Jesus uses in that sermon where he says, blessed are the poor, the word for that is anoim. And what that means, it means when the Babylonians came and captured Jerusalem, they carried off all the good people, all the rich people, all the wealthy people, all the people who had knowledge. They carried them back to Babylon to make Babylon better. What do you do to make a nation better? You steal the knowledge of another nation, and that's what they did. They took all the good people and they carried them back. That's how come they had Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego and all those Jews. They carried them back because they were wealthy, or they had knowledge, or they had something they could use. And everybody else they left. They left behind. The ones who were poor, the ones who were lame, the ones who didn't have knowledge, the ones who they didn't want. they left behind in Jerusalem. And in the grottos of Jerusalem, Jeremiah writes Lamentations when there's nobody left there that in our mind would be worth anything. Those were the Anawim, the ones that were left. And when Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, when he says, blessed are the Anawim, blessed are the poor in spirit, that's what he's talking about. Blessed are you who are left behind, who are looked over, who nobody wants. Blessed are you. I will bring the good news to the poor. Not just the poor, but the poor in spirit. And it's amazing when you think about the Sermon on the Mount, the content of it. And I'm not going to go into that tonight. I've preached that several times. But you know, the content of the Sermon on the Mount, the things we pull out of the Sermon on the Mount, from the Beatitudes, the blessed, right? To your salt and your light, to beyond the law, right? Moses said this, you've heard this, and yet I say, right? You've heard it say, don't commit adultery, and I say, a man that looks after her commits adultery, right, in his heart, you know. Do not commit murder, but I say, you who hates his brother. Jesus goes so beyond the law. He takes the law and he says, you've heard this, but I'm telling you, it's in your heart. It's not just what's on the paper. It's not just what's on the letter, but it's in your heart. And then Jesus gets down to the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7, right? And he says, many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not cast out demons in your names and do things in your name? And Jesus say, depart from me, right? I did not know you. Blessed are you who keeps my commandments. And Jesus gives those commandments from Matthew 5 to the end of Matthew 7. And we use that Matthew 7:21 verse a lot, where he says, depart from me, I do not know you. And yet, where's that at? It's at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. And then Jesus, at the end of that, he says, blessed are you, right? Blessed are you who keeps my words and acts on them. You know, Jesus didn't just preach a sermon and say, oh, there you go, you know, here's a bunch of words, here's a bunch of good thoughts, here's a bunch of philosophy, here's a bunch of things that, you know, maybe might make you think about things a little different. Jesus said, you need to do this. And I think when people read the Sermon on the Mount, and I do too, you read the Sermon on the Mount and you think, you can't do that. You know, nobody can do that. Nobody can live that good. Nobody can live that right. Nobody can live the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus just preached this philosophical thing, you know, this thing that he just held up the perfect example, didn't he? Jesus held up the perfect example. Pray for your enemies. Do good to those who use you, right? Jesus give us this perfect example, perfect way. And people read the Sermon on the Mount and they say, nobody can do that. Nobody can live the Sermon on the Mount. You know, there's a book in our hymnal by Scrivener, you know, when we fail to pray, you know, oh, come on. Help me out. By Scrivener that says, you know, oh, what grief we often forfeit. Oh, what needless pain we bear, all because we do not carry everything to God in prayer. You know that song, right? You know the man that wrote that? His name was Joseph Scriven, right? And if you don't know his story, you got to know his story because it really relates to the Sermon on the Mount, because Joseph was an Irishman, and he was going to get married to a lady, and it was the night before his wedding. And Joseph rode his horse. This is a long time ago, right? And Joseph rides his horse to meet this woman that he's going to marry. Middle of the night before he's going to get married. He rides his horse to meet this woman, and she falls off this horse, or something happens to her, and she drowns in this river. And Joseph, he's heartbroken, right? And he's in Ireland. And so Joseph immigrates to Canada, to Good Hope, Hope Bay, Good Hope. I don't know, you have to look at it. I'm doing my best. Canada. And Joseph moves to Canada, and he's a pretty smart guy. And he starts tutoring for this baron or captain or somebody that has money. And he falls in love with the guy's daughter. And so boy Joseph finally gets a break, right? Joseph's going to marry this guy's daughter. It's all set. Joseph's going to marry daughter. She gets ill, some sort of fever, plague, I don't remember. She gets ill and dies. And so Joseph, he devotes his life to the Sermon on the Mount. Joseph devotes his life to living the Sermon on the Mount. And so Joseph, he tries to live this to the best of his ability. And he he's known because he's helping all these people who can't afford it or can't pay, or these widows and all these people. And he's got this box of tools, and he goes around the community, and he's helping these people. And this one guy looks at Joseph, and he says, I'd really like to hire that guy. And the guy says, well, that's the funny thing about Joseph. You can't hire him. You know, unless you need him, you can't hire him. He won't work for you. But if you need him, then he'll come and he'll do this. But in the midst of Joseph's grief and despair, Joseph sits down and he writes this letter to his mother. In this letter to his mother, it says, you know, oh, what needless pain we bear, all what grief we often forfeit, oh, what needless pain we bear, all because we do not carry everything to God in prayer. And he sends this letter to his mother. And years later, somebody finds this poem, somebody puts it to music. They don't even know Joseph's the guy who actually wrote the lyrics. But eventually they find out that Joseph Scriven is the guy who actually wrote these lyrics. And Joseph drowns eventually in this Good Hope Bay. And some people think it was an accident, and some people think that Joseph committed suicide. But Joseph, it's a good story. Look it up, Google it. I might not have all the facts exactly right, but that's the basic gist of it. But Joseph, in his life, after all this grief and all this tragedy, and he writes this poem to his mom, but Joseph made it his mission to live the Sermon on the Mount. And, you know, if you really read the whole Sermon on the Mount, and you really take all that out of it, and you think, wow, you know, here's a guy who listened to Jesus in his grief and his despair. He listened to Jesus, and he listened to these words, and he was a wise man because he built his house on the rock, and the rain fell, and the rivers rose, and the winds blew and pounded that house, and yet it did not collapse because its foundation was on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and doesn't act on them will be like the foolish man who built his house on the sand, and the rain fell, and the rivers arose, and the wind blew and pounded that house, and it collapsed. It collapsed with a great crash, Jesus says. You know, people say, Rex, you can't live that sermon. It's too perfect. Nobody can do that. Nobody can be that good. But Jesus said, we can be. Jesus would never give us something that we couldn't do if we try hard enough. So when you read the Sermon on the Mount, I wish you'd read that this week, because I read it today. I hadn't read it in a while, the whole thing. It's funny how I pick out a lot of pieces of it sometimes, but I hadn't sat down and read the whole thing in a while. And when you sit down and read the whole Sermon on the Mount and you get to the end of it, and you don't try to overthink it or overanalyze it, and you get to the end of it and you think, wow, Jesus was the master. He knew how to make it come to life. He knew how to tell us to be better, to be who we need to be. He knew how to tell us that our life's important and that it's in our heart and that we need to listen to him. Anyway, just some random thoughts from a person who struggles to sometimes live up to what God expects. But hope you got something out of it. Thanks for your time this evening. If you can help, we can help you at all. Let us know.